Well. It has been a long time coming, but here it is. I'm finally reviewing that giant book, and just my notes alone is quite a lot of paper. So I don't know how long this is going to be, and I don't even know if my phone has the space to hold all this audio, but we will see. All right, I am going to be reading from my notes a lot because it's way too much to keep up here. I don't have the RAM for that, if you know what I mean. So I heard really good things about this book from Christian naturists, so I decided to check it out from my seminary's library loan system. Thought it would be worth a read, and it was. It was fantastic. We're going to get to that in a second. I looked up the book, and it's $200. So I thought the library was a great option to, take a look at it before I decide whether or not I want to buy it. And it has 30 chapters, and in the end I only found about 10 chapters that were relevant to the question of naturism and the Bible. So that's only, what, like $60 or $70 worth of material. So I'm not interested in buying the entire book because over half of it is just about useless to me. It doesn't mean that it's useless for everything, it just means that for my particular area of study, not all of it is relevant. But I've already found a few of the articles available on their own, and I suspect I can buy every single article on its own from their sources. Because the book doesn't have chapters, it's not one author, it's an amalgamation of lots of authors coming together writing scholarly articles, and they all got put into this book. So why am I saying that these other chapters are irrelevant? Well, it's because they're irrelevant, but... for example, Article 4 was composed of just descriptions about how cloth was made in the Bronze Age. That's great. It's great historical information, archaeological information, but it doesn't tell me anything about the practical everyday life of people in the Bronze Age. It doesn't tell me about the morality around clothes or the practicality of clothes at the time. So it just wasn't relevant. It's not that certain chapters were challenging to the idea of naturism, because none of them were. It was just that some of them were relevant and some of them weren't. However, some of them were very juicy, as we're about to get into. Just let me flip this page around. This is not going to be one of my prettier videos, but it is going to be informative. Come here. Okay. Article number 1 was particularly good. It was first for a reason, I think. You'll see the title on screen now. It's by Anna Katarina Hoflinker, I think. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. But she starts out on the first page of her article. She says this: in the Victorian era, a bourgeois woman left her home with her body almost completely covered. She wore a long dress that cloaked her body from neck to toe, her hands in gloves, and her head covered with a hat. To go out without a hat or gloves would have been to go out naked. During the same time period, some cultures in South America, for example, the Waica, a group of Yanomami in the south of modern Venezuela and the north of Brazil, wore nothing but a string, for men, or a fringed belt, women, around their hips, holding, in the case of men, the penis in a certain position. Some ethnographers describe how the loss of these strings caused the men to feel, quote, naked, even though from a European perspective, they were already uncovered, end quote. So, from the outset, we've got really good material. Here the author points out that in the same time period, we have these two different things. And she makes this conclusion, quote, these two examples from the same time period show that nudity is not something that is naturally felt, bodily fixed, or universal, but something determined by different sociological perspectives. What someone regards as nudity is based first and foremost on individual feelings and culture and time-specific shared meanings. In this chapter, the author also argues that clothing is a communicative medium. communicating a surprising array of social data to the observer. And this is something that I've wondered about for a long time. You'll actually find this in scholarly articles about like the philosophy of fashion. Yes, there's like a whole intellectual, scholarly study of fashion. She says this late in the chapter. Quote, to summarize, nudity can be connected to basic sociological categories such as birth and or death, sexuality and fertility, or human beginnings. A mythological birth, as in the case of the story of Adam and Eve. I would disagree with the mythological there, but we continue. Additionally, nakedness is used in processes of differentiation. It becomes a sign of the other. It can form ethnic differentiation, for example, in the construction of the wild versus the clothed or civilized, she says. I like that. She called attention to some humans being wild. However, social differentiation can also be transmitted via the body. In this context, nakedness can be a code for poverty, slavery, or the social outcast. Switching pages here. But nudity can also mark abnormal human conditions, such as Noah's drunkenness. Hence, especially in the cultures integrating in the Hebrew Bible and their social imaginary, nudity is often connected with a deviation from what is considered, quote, normal. Therefore, religious processes of demarcation can also be formed on the basis of nakedness or of covering the body. Nudity can, especially in a religious ritual context, differentiate between the normal everyday life and a special sacred time. Here, too, nudity is connected to something special and not normal. Nudity in this context can play a part in religious rituals, showing this liminal setting of religion. The microphone is not recording. I'll fix that. There, maybe you can hear me now. Where was I? Sacred time, blah, 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 differentiation. She also says, in all of these cases, nudity creates meaning with regard to salvation or doom. A promise of salvation in a religious or social case can be connected to the staging of the body, and nudity is linked to the normative aspect of the social imaginary. So, I mean, article number 1, pretty good material. My notes here say article, that was a very loud bird, I hope you picked that up on the mic. Article 2 is marked as irrelevant. That was probably one of the more philosophical chapters. All right. Ooh, anthropological studies, article number 3. I like this one. So, okay, you'll see the title on screen. This one's going to go by really fast. I've got a lot of short notes here that don't read very well. So he offers 5 reasons that clothing gets invented by various cultures at various times. Physical reasons, to protect the body. Social reasons, to distinguish between different classes or social roles. Moral reasons, from the sense that you have to cover the body or it's, immoral. You have aesthetic and sexual reasons. It says here, the instinct of adornment caused by humans to make jewelry first, and second, clothes to appeal to the opposite sex. So a reproductive purpose for clothing. Sort of a mating sort of a purpose. And there's the magical thing, like wearing certain things in certain ritual contexts, that kind of thing. He also says that trying to make one pat answer for every invention of clothing across the species is mistaken, and I agree. Clothing is invented and used by various cultures for various reasons, not just one. Then he starts to look at this in more depth. He says, today, whether humans make or wear clothes or not is above all a question of climate conditions, economic and technical skills, and social and fashion conventions. Still recording, okay. This is why in different parts of the world, people have developed clothes for different reasons, or not. Then he says, well, let's start with the physical reason. Historically, some indigenous people can be found who never developed clothes, especially in Central Africa, Australia, and South America. Near the equator, the climate is warm year-round, and there is no need to cover the body with clothes to keep warm or protect from the sun. Of course, these people developed forms of adornment, but as mentioned before, adornment is not clothing. For instance, tattoos are one of the oldest forms of adornment we know from archaeology. So here he draws a distinction between decorating the body versus covering the body with clothing. Then he says, for colder regions, we have evidence that people lived naked and never developed clothes, namely in Tierra del Fuego. The Agan and Alacalufe peoples did not develop clothes even though the climate is very harsh there. They had a fur coat of sorts. Quote, coat is in quotes here. I wish I could show the image. It is basically just a fur blanket that would hang on the shoulders. Like if you got up out of the bed in the winter and you wrapped the blanket around your shoulders, that's basically what it looked like. They had a fur coat hanging around the shoulders, but it was not to protect against the cold. It was instead used as a bed. A bee just landed on my tripod. Okay. At least it's not on my face. He also says some indigenous peoples without genital coverings do have taboos against staring at genitals, which I think is a very reasonable rule to have. Then the next page, he says, to sum up, there is no singular reason why humans made and make clothes. And he talks about the reasons again. He has some fundamental generalizations here that he says are true across the human race. He says, people who lived close to the equator wore fewer clothes. People who lived close to the poles wore more clothes. In other words, the further one moves from the equator to the north or south, the more the use of clothes increases even today. This is a consequence of climate conditions and solar radiation. Clothing is different in regions that have a changing climate during the year, i.e., they have seasons. While in regions with a stable climate, the people wear or do not wear clothes year-round. In regions that have seasons, people wear less in summer and more in the wintertime. Generalization number 3, people on the Eurasian and African continents wore clothes, while people in the Americas, as well as Transoceania, I guess he means the Pacific, did not wear clothes. That means, on the one hand, that clothing has a history and was spread throughout the connected continents. On the other hand, clothing is in anthropological terms not a basic need, but has more functional aspects. Number 4, common people wore less than those who were marked by a particular social role, for example, priests, leaders, and kings. Switching my page again. He goes on the next several pages to give many examples of the variation of the type and extent of clothing across the globe from an anthropological perspective. That was super interesting to see. He gives examples all the way from total nakedness or just wearing the belly string to just a loincloth, all the way to the almost total coverage that you get in certain cultures, like in certain places in the Middle East, for example. Changing pages again. All right, we're moving on to article number 4. Not a lot to say about this one. It just talks about sackcloth. The principal quote here is, the sackcloth is intended to be very uncomfortable and therefore must be made of hard, coarse fiber or hair. Then I have a note here, articles 5 through 7 marked as irrelevant. Again, not useless and not challenging to naturism, just not relevant to this question. Article number 8. Wolfgang Zwickel here says, although nakedness and undressing always had an erotic aspect, naked people were evidently part of daily life. You see, I wonder what Zwickel means by always and erotic here, because lots of other passages in this book contradict him. I don't, even for the Old Testament, I don't understand how it can be that naked people were around all the time and it was always erotic. That doesn't, he doesn't explain that very well in this article, so I'm not sure what he means. Granted, the book also was probably originally written in German, given all the names here. So maybe it just didn't translate well into English. I don't know. I don't speak German. So he also says here, sometimes prophets demonstrated their exceptional position in ancient society by wearing specific clothes. Some of the prophets in states of ecstasy remained naked. We have various passages for that. Then we have article number 9. This is important for the book of Genesis, because sometimes textiles will challenge me on this, but here we have a scholar saying the same basic thing that I say about these passages. This says, in metaphorical language, this Hebrew word for nakedness, it's spelled E-R-W-A here. I've usually heard it said erva. You can correct my pronunciation in the comments. I'm not very good at pronouncing Hebrew. Erva can denote weak spots of a country that spies try to discover. This is when erva is used metaphorically. The example they give here is when Joseph's brothers come to Egypt, and Joseph says, "No, you've come to see the nakedness of the land." I've heard textile speakers say, "Oh, he's referring to all." There's a critter in the woods. Of course there is. But it's where Joseph says, "You come to spy out the nakedness of the land," and textiles want to say, "Oh, he's just talking about the naked slaves and things." And well, no. Here, this scholar, whose name I will not attempt to pronounce, says that this was a metaphor for you're looking for weak spots in the military defenses of the land. You're looking for exposed parts of the land. He also says, even everyday clothing was comparatively valuable for the greater part of the population in the ancient Near East. Its economic significance can be inferred from the dowry lists in Aramaic marriage contracts from the Elephantine during the Persian period, where the exact value of certain types of garments and other household goods is specified in detail. Ordinary people would normally have owned only 2 or 3 main outfits. Then he has another quote that says, "A substantial wardrobe was considered a luxury." Here he cites Job chapter 27. I am very thirsty. Put this over here. A couple of years ago, I picked up this because I kept running out of water at work. Now I don't run out of water anymore. This is a full gallon of water. All right, that's it for Article 9. Article 10, another name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce because I'm an ignorant American. So, Chapter 10 mentions some things that kind of touch on the issues, but its content isn't super helpful in moving the conversation forward on the specific question of naturism. Page 247, he says there's no such thing as natural nudity since the concept of nature is itself a product of human culture. Primitive versus natural. Yeah, it's not super helpful. Article 10 is semi-relevant. All right, and then I see here my notes say Articles 11 through 16 are also irrelevant, so we're going to skip all the way to Article 17. I think I'm pretty safe saying Kessler. What do you think? All right, Kessler opens in part by listing out the various sections of the article. I like this opening. He says, besides the physical aspect, clothing is of high symbolic significance. It is connected to shame and honor. Thus, forcibly stripping someone is an act of shaming that person. Each sentence is a different section of the chapter, by the way. He's giving like chapter headings in the form of sentences. An act of shaming that person. Some texts in the Bible speak of nakedness in the context of poverty. What exactly is meant when these texts speak of naked persons? After some general remarks about the naked poor, the final section of the chapter will consider the relevant biblical texts that speak of clothing the poor as an act of righteousness. Different quote now. Special clothes give people special honor. Wearing clothes at all is the fundamental sign of being human. Thus, to strip a person by force is an act of dishonoring that person. Next quote. It's not a quote. He points to various archaeological finds in iconography that show that captives, military captives, war captives, were often completely naked in the Bronze Age. Very important when we get to Isaiah chapter 20. Kessler notes the various passages that mention the practice of forcibly stripping an adulterous wife in public. It's interesting. I like this note I have here. I'll just read it in full because it's, intelligible. Seeing these passages strung together, I've begun to theorize that this practice may have involved or arisen from some kind of public examination of the wife's sexual organs for evidence of infertility. I ponder this because of the repeated emphasis on the general public's absolute visual fixation on the wife's genitals, such as in Nahum 3:5. So, like I said, it's a theory. I don't know, but it seems to kind of tend that way when I read the passages. Let me know what you think. Next quote: being shamed by one's own nakedness is, whoa, kicked the tripod, sorry. Being shamed by one's own nakedness is true for poor people, though in a different way. It is neither a victorious enemy nor a jealous husband who takes away their clothes, but the economic and social condition they live in. Still recording. However, the effect is the same as in the case of captives or adulterous wives. Poor people are humiliated and shamed by their nakedness. Next quote. In the book of Job, Eliphaz accuses Job of having stripped the naked of their clothes. It seems that the naked wore something that could be taken away. End quote. I actually disagree with Kessler here, and here's why. Let me just read this. Here I disagree with Kessler. One could just as easily write, "You have driven the homeless from their homes," or "You have slain the husbands of widows," or "It is you who killed our dead." So Eliphaz could just as easily be accusing Job of being the reason these people are naked in the first place, I think. Now, granted, some Hebrew scholar may be able to contradict that, but it doesn't seem obvious from reading the passage that this has to be that Job is looking at a person who's already naked and then making them more naked. It seems to be that he could be saying, probably is saying, I think, that Job is the reason these people were naked in the first place. All right, next quote. Nakedness is not an isolated phenomenon in the context of poverty. It nearly always appears together with hunger. The text of Job 22 above continues with the following accusation. You have given no water to the weary to drink, and you have withheld bread from the hungry. So the same place where Job is accused of withholding clothing from the poor, or stripping the poor of their clothing, he's also accused of starving them. That's very, very, very key. Kessler here also references Deuteronomy 28:48, Ezekiel 18, and maybe especially Isaiah 58:7 as examples of nudity being related to other classic signs of poverty. This is critical for understanding nakedness in the Old Testament because it is quite often a way of establishing absolute destitution in the text, because it's just how the world worked at the time. It's hard for us to remember that as first world Westerners, where we get our t-shirts and jeans from factories and they cost us $6 a piece if we buy them used, etc. And we can have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing, even if we're fairly low-income people. That was not possible in the ancient world. It was all handmade, very expensive. Now I'm rambling and going on a whole rant, but let me just continue with this. It is evident that poverty affects all aspects of human existence. So it is easy to understand that poor people lack everything: sufficient food, adequate clothing, and a shelter worthy of human beings. So Kessler points to Job 22:6a as evidence that the clothing of the poor was often stripped from them in forming legal agreements with their superiors, their social superiors, or economic superiors, however you want to say that. He also paints a history of clothing and nakedness as it relates to poverty across Israeli history in the Old Testament. Egyptian noblemen in the ancient world boasted that they had given bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothing to the naked, and boats to the boatless. Yes, boats to the boatless. I thought that was hilarious. In the next paragraph, Kessler notes that even the poor in comparatively early Israeli kingdom history, like 8th century BCE, are described as having garments, like in Amos 2:8. They pay taxes, like in Amos 5:11, and they own houses and fields, like in Isaiah 5 and Micah 2:2. But then he continues, the situation changes at the end of the pre-exilic period. The earliest text of the Hebrew Bible that mentions, quote, the hungry and the naked as social types is Ezekiel 18. This text cannot be earlier than the late pre-exilic, or more probably, the exilic period. Keep losing their place. In Isaiah 58:7, the next text mentioning the hungry, the homeless, the naked, certainly dates from the Persian period. Job 31:19-20, where Job praises himself for having clothed the naked, is also a post-exilic text. Having studied the Old Testament in seminary, I am not convinced that Job is post-exilic, but that's a whole other issue. We can conclude that in Israel and Judah, the social crisis that began in the 8th century later produced a group of absolutely poor people who, according to the aforementioned text of Job 24, had almost nothing. They lived on borrowing, begging, and stealing. Again, this forms a pretty good basis, I think, for my interpretation of Genesis 2:25 as being a defense of primeval nakedness against later Israeli assumptions about nakedness, poverty, and honor. Pictured as perpetually naked, Adam and Chava could easily have been assumed to be in a defective state by early Israeli audiences. Yet, the author goes out of his way to defend their nakedness on the grounds of honor. Kessler offers several passages advocating for the clothing of the naked as an act of charity. These passages go to show the physicality of the mandate to clothe the poor, the visceral vulnerability of the poor to the elements as a result of their destitution. They are hungry, homeless, naked, they have nothing. Job even says the reason he offered clothing to the poor was to protect their bodies from the elements. He says, "Never have I seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or a poor person without covering, whose loins have not blessed me, and who was not warmed by the fleece of my sheep." Later on, Kessler says, the author of the book of Job does not abandon the idea of clothing the naked as an act of righteousness, but instead shifts it in the direction of patriarchal charity. So if you are a wealthy patriarch, if you are a man of means, it is your duty to help the poor. He says later, in the Hebrew Bible, to be naked means more than to lack clothing. It means to be dishonored. Stripping a person by force, whether by direct violence or structural violence, such as in the case of the socially naked, like poor people, is equivalent to shaming that person. As Claudia Bender and Sabine Bieberstein have concluded, clothing is essential to uphold a person's honor and dignity. Through exposure as punishment or reduction of clothing, prisoners of war, refugees, poor people, the dishonor of a person can be effectively represented. Another quote from Kessler, the idea of clothing the naked has a long tradition, especially in Egyptian literature. In the Hebrew Bible, it appears in relatively late texts, probably because the problem of totally impoverished people became urgent no earlier than the late pre-exilic times. The few texts that speak of clothing the naked see it as an act of justice and righteousness. In Job 29 through 31, the stress lies more on the compassion of the members of the elite, although the latter is embedded in the wider concept of doing justice. In Ezekiel 18 and Isaiah 58, okay, so he's talking about it's a very physical concern. He does say that we have God talking about clothing the naked in Deuteronomy 10, but we never see God actually clothing the naked as an act of charity. I disagree with Kessler here, because Adam and Eve were very vulnerable in Genesis chapter 3 when he promised them thorns and thistles, and then he immediately clothed them with leather. I would say that's clothing the naked, wouldn't you? Next page. Here he says, because God assigns this to himself, and because of the priority placed on it in the Old Testament, he says this. I love this quote. The demand to clothe the poor is not a plea for something the righteous could do or not do. It is the essence of justice and righteousness, and it is rooted in God's own actions. Now, why is that? That's because it's a matter of providing for people's well-being. Of course, that's the essence of righteousness. Article 18 is not relevant. Okay, 19 mainly looks at ancient rabbinical interpretations of Genesis chapters 2 and 3. I'm not going to get super in-depth into the interpretations, but let me read the first paragraph or two of my notes, and then the last couple, because I think that's all we're going to need from this chapter to understand my perspective on it. This chapter mainly looked into ancient rabbinical interpretations of the passage. These appear to take later concepts and shoehorn them into the text, including the insistence that Adam and Eve virtuously sewed the fig leaves together to prevent exposing their genitals to their spouse's eyes. It's unclear how or why it would be immoral to expose one's genitals to one's spouse, especially since Song of Songs clearly celebrates and glorifies such behavior, even giving the impression of a couple adoringly and intently staring at each other's genitals. Read Song of Songs sometimes, it's very intense. The other interpretations seem similarly anachronistic, eisegetical, and or overly mystical. Another point in my notes, I don't think it's in here, but in some of my other notes on the book, I wrote that these rabbis seem to view the world from an ivory tower through piety-colored glasses. They don't seem to take any consideration at all for the practical everyday life of the poor, of the commoner. It reads as very, very mystical, very heady, very pious, very elite, but you don't really get the perspective of the common person. I prefer Marty Solomon's interpretation, which he seems to have gotten from a man called David Foreman. You can find Marty Solomon's interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3 in the Bema Discipleship podcast. Look for session 1. It's called season 1 on the Apple Podcast app, but Solomon calls it session 1. Solomon's interpretation, Marty Solomon's interpretation, seems more faithful to the content of the text itself. It doesn't paint married couples as needing to hide from one another. If these ancient interpretations were indeed offered by ancient rabbis, then I fear they had lost some of the core meanings of this passage and had become Here's in my notes where I say it was piety-colored glasses. So let's look at the later part of my notes here. All right, I'm going to conclude my thoughts on this article thusly. Still recording. All right. Obviously, I have some problems with these rabbinical interpretations. First, they seem to completely overlook the physical vulnerability of humans. This interpretation I'm looking at said that Adam and Eve being naked was a basically fundamentally defective state, and that ultimately them putting fig leaves on improved their state, and that Yahweh improved on it further by clothing them. So it seems to completely overlook the physical vulnerability of humans following the cursing of the land, which introduced hitherto unknown dangers to human skin, i.e. thorns and thistles. And therefore the physical necessity of clothing and Yahweh's quite exemplary charitable intervention in this regard. That was introduced, yeah. Second, it also seems to ignore Yahweh's unabashed proclamation at the conclusion of day 6 that his creation was, quote, extremely good. There was nothing left that could improve upon what he had made. It was already good. This interpretation presents Adam and Eve in a pitiable, ignorant, inferior, unenviable, backward, inappropriate, defective, which hardly seems extremely good, situation that must then be improved upon via the imposition of clothing. What does this say about Yahweh? That his creation was not extremely good? By extension, could this mean that Yahweh himself is a defective creator? Or a defective critic of creation? Or both? How could Yahweh's creation be at once defective and, quote, extremely good? Also, Hartenstein claims that the leaf garments were not sufficient to confront God, yet Yahweh himself offers no such evaluation in the text. In fact, the closest we get to an evaluation of the value of the fig leaves in presenting human bodies to Yahweh's presence is Yahweh's own question, who told you you were naked? Yahweh himself seems to challenge the idea that they have to dress up to come to him. So I didn't find a lot of value in this chapter. They didn't support the interpretations a whole lot, it seemed to me. It just didn't really deal with the issues, I felt like. It was interesting to read the rabbinical interpretations, don't get me wrong, but I think there's a lot left out here. So articles chapter 20 through 22 are irrelevant. Then we get to the priestly garments. This one's pretty short. All right. My notes on this one are short, I mean. Although the general purpose of the directive in Exodus 28, 42 through 43 is quite evident, that is, the prevention of accidental exposure of the penis during priestly duties, several important questions remain. For instance, it is not entirely clear whether the sole intention of the breaches is to avert an accidental exposure of the genitals, or whether there might be an additional or alternative purpose, for example, to prevent the priestly garments from becoming impure through bodily discharges. Here, Berner admits that other purposes could have been intended behind this garment. This is where my theory about the dimensions of the undergarment as compared to the male reproductive anatomy comes in. The breeches reach from the navel to halfway down the thigh. Virtually no human male is capable of sexual intercourse while wearing such a garment. I add virtually there because there might be a guy out there. If there is, then I don't envy him. Assuming the priest would never remove this while on duty, it would function quite well as a chastity garment. I'm not saying that it did function this way, but I'm saying that it could. And that it would, intentionally or not. Ooh, okay, my camera is glitching a little bit. It might be overheating from the long video here. So let's press on. Where's my... Okay, I see it. This other one is about... This is Article 26. It's about David and Michal, however you say her name. And this guy talks about how in Exodus it says that priests aren't supposed to allow their penises to be exposed, and then David exposes his penis when he dances. He makes the argument that based on the Hebrew here and the art and dancing styles at the time, that David was like doing a rotating motion, and that the flap covering his genitals would swing when he danced, based on the common dancing of the time. And the word that is used to say dance in the text is this particular dance move of the rotating. It was very vigorous. It was really flashy, if you pardon the expression. Sorry. I didn't mean to make that pun, but there you go, a pun, just for free. So he asked the question, does this represent a contradiction in the Bible? And I would say no, because the garment in Exodus, the rule there is for priests, is for Levite priests in the tabernacle on duty. So it doesn't even apply to Levites. It doesn't even apply to priests, let alone Levites, when they're off duty. So of course it wouldn't apply to David. He's from the tribe of Judah. He's not even a Levite, let alone a priest. So there you go. Article 27 is irrelevant, and if I recall correctly, Article 28 is the last one that I'm going to look at. Let me confirm that. Yep, that's the last chapter that I'm going to cover. So he basically says in this chapter that it's basically inevitable in Isaiah chapter 20 that Isaiah is totally naked. And he looks at it iconographically from stelae that have been uncovered in the region, etc., etc. Historically, we know war captives were naked. And Isaiah is representing war captives. He's told to remove his sackcloth, which was worn as the only garment someone would be wearing, with no underwear to maximize the discomfort. So God says, take off your sackcloth and be naked. That's unambiguous. And then it even says buttocks later on when he's talking about what he's symbolizing. So it doesn't leave a lot to the imagination. Okay, so that's it for all the chapters. Like I said, I'm not going to buy the book, but I do plan to purchase the relevant chapters. Some of these are very, very valuable. And even if it costs $65, $70 to get all of the articles, I'm still going to save money. So I'm not having to buy the entire book. So, but what's even more valuable, perhaps, than the book itself is the bibliographies in the book, because you get all the sources that built the book. All the information in this book came from other sources, or, probably most of it. A lot of it came from other sources, and the bibliographies give you access to that. And the articles themselves will include the biographies. I have all the biographies written down at my house. I have the bibliographies, not biographies, the bibliographies for later reference. I think the information in this book is valuable as historical and anthropological support for the types of claims made to support Christian naturism, but I don't think it's worth buying the entire book. So there you have it. There's a review of Clothing and Nakedness in the Hebrew Bible. It's a phenomenal scholarly work. I have a lot of respect for the people that made it. I think the story behind the book is pretty funny, because they talk about a conversation they had talking about this question, and then they said, well, why don't we just write a book about it, study it deeper. And they did. And I think it turned out really well. So that's it for the video, pretty much. So I think, there's the camera. I think you know what time it is. This episode of Mudwalkers is brought to you by Nature Him, Todd, Jacob, Brian, Jay Sweets, Edward, John S., Skating Aimlessly, Joseph, Charlie, Lionheart, Liam, Harry, Jesse, Max, Adam, Edward T., Nate, Seaberryman, Shane, Jay, Cyan, Reese, John W., Clifton, and Darian. Thank you all so much for supporting me on Patreon. You're making my channel possible. You're keeping my work sustainable. I can't thank you enough for all that you do over on Patreon. If you're not already a Patreon member, check out the link in the description. We have a $5 and $10 tiers. We have tiers. We have a $5 tier and a $10 tier. Check out the link in the description. Both tiers get early access to all my videos, but the $10 tier gets access to a Zoom hangout with me and my other patrons once a month. Lots of fun. That'll be it for this video. I will see you in the next one.